Thank you, Zoe, for joining us for this conversation, flying down from Canberra.
My pleasure. Always a nice excuse to come to Melbourne.
Thank you. Wonderful introduction by Mani. I'm very interested in all the work you've done across government and now in the think tank space. But also, you studied the social science of internet, which is very interesting. I'll come back to it in a bit. But we have heard today from researchers and CSIRO. We've heard from corporates, businesses. What role does think tank play? And can you also tell us a bit more about your work with the Tech Design Policy Institute and how they play a role in think tanks and civil society organizations play a role in global AI governance, but also responsible collaboration?
Thanks, Jafrin. Well, this is a dangerous thing because I absolutely love think tanking, so I'll try not to get on my soapbox about this. It's really wonderful to be here with everyone. I feel like there's already been a really generous introduction, but just to tell you a little bit about the organisation that I've co-founded with a wonderful colleague, Johanna Weaver. It's called the Tech Policy Design Institute. So we're a think tank, which I'll tell you a little bit about what we do, and then I can speak more broadly about the value that I think think tanks have. So we are an independent, not-for-profit. We've just spun out of ANU. We were a research centre there, incubated there for several years. And so now as an independent organisation, there are several ways that we work. So we do research programs, but we also, which is very common, obviously, that's what a lot of think tanks do. But an additional thing that we do that I think is relevant for this conversation as well is we do education. So we really look at, it's not, I guess in my mind, it's not just give people fish, it's teach them to fish. So it's like you don't just put out research reports with the policy answer to every question. It's also about how do you build capability. So we do education programs, particularly focused on technology policy, that are focused on public servants, but also people in industry and civil society. How do we raise the bar of this conversation, which can sometimes seem daunting or complex, and how do we bring those groups together? And then lastly, which I've kind of alluded to, we build community. So we really believe that think tanks play a role in bridging those communities. So whether it's through government and not just, and that's also splitting the public service and politicians, which are also parliamentarians, which are different groups as well. How do we bring those together with industry and civil society to have a joined up conversation about tech policy? And we also work internationally. So I think the theme that you'll hear through all of that is that we at the Tech Policy Design Institute, and I think a lot of think tanks and the value that they bring is kind of building bridges from academia into practical policy applications across multi-stakeholder groups and also across countries, often that there's collaboration into different countries as well. And when we do all of that, tech geopolitics is one of the key topics that we focus on at the Tech Policy Design Institute, which suits me nicely because it's one of my passion topics.
Yeah, just to draw on the AI literacy part that you were talking about, you obviously did a degree in social science of the internet. Can you tell us a bit more of what that looks like? And also, do you think that would change going forward, particularly as we move from not just the internet, but into the next digital revolution of AI? Do you think there will be degrees on social science of AI?
That's a good question. I did think that degree, I did think the name was sort of starting to date itself a little bit, maybe. It was a fascinating degree. I think specifically what it is it's a social science degree, so statistics and those sorts of things, and applying social science methodologies to studying the relationship between the internet and society. It was a fascinating course because that's such a broad topic, actually, that even though it sounds like a niche course, and in some ways it is, the diversity things that people in my cohort were studying was everything from, how the internet enables environmental activist groups in Singapore through to, drone warfare in Ukraine. And I was looking at the power dimensions between big tech companies and governments from a foreign policy perspective. So the diversity there is huge. I think that we will obviously see education trying to catch up with these changing topics, and obviously AI being a new focus there. But it's not really surprising that a lot of the sandstone universities just take a little time to catch up. It takes a long time to get a course approval done, so we all understand that. No offense to anyone in the room who works in academia. Yeah.
Thanks, Zoe. You mentioned the intersection with foreign policy and technology there. So we are at a very interesting time in the current world where we're kind of in a geopolitical shift where the international rules-based order is also kind of probably reshaping and being challenged. How do you see AI and like the digital revolution and the geopolitical transformation working out, particularly also in a time when you see technology and tech billionaires kind of probably having a bit more say than we would have expected in shaping the international conversation and the foreign policy conversations. Do you think we are closer to getting to a future where, you know, they'll have more power than nation states?
Interesting times is definitely one way to put the times that we're living in. I always try and remind myself that for, I'm sure many other people in this room as well, there's an element of, if you're working on the intersection of technology and geopolitics, you probably have a little bit of job security, which is a good thing. This is a highly topical issue. So I think I'm very, very interested, as I just mentioned, in the power relationship between these increasingly large tech companies and governments. From a sovereignty perspective, from a foreign policy perspective, there's so much to talk about. And it was what I did my thesis on in that Oxford course, so I will try and make this succinct. For me, what's interesting is I felt like I was the provocateur. I enjoy that kind of role in saying, and have been for several years, saying, well, really, what is the difference between the role that governments are playing and some of these companies? Okay, so governments set rules, they enforce rules, they have norms, they can have punishments, they facilitate services. Like, just playing devil's advocate and saying, like, talk to me really about, like, what is people vote with, where they choose to be a customer, all these types of things. So I was really on that bandwagon for a while, and that was sort of one of the things that I was trying to challenge and test through expert interviews with people who worked in government or work in government and in these companies as part of my thesis. What I would say that I'm finding most fascinating, so a long way of saying, yes, I think that there's a lot to talk about how these companies are wielding government-like power, and you see that all the time, even if you just look at market size, the size of the GDP of a small country versus some of these, it's not even, right? And you see that play out in policy development and the leverage that those governments feel that they do or don't have. But what's really interesting to me is the last 2 years, I'd say, that even people like myself who are really leaning into that narrative, it's really interesting to see this return of like more traditional geoeconomics. And I think that we would have held up US tech companies as the example of, look, you know, Amazon's out there, Meta's out there, they've got Apple, they've got their own philosophies, they've got their own interests, they're making these decisions. What's interesting, particularly under the Trump administration, almost this really obvious and explicit regression to a sense of like the techno-nationalism framing, in the sense that these companies are seen increasingly, in my opinion, to have a close relationship with the US government, both in terms of how they're perceived by other governments. So this threat from Trump administration around, if say you're a government like Australia, if you regulate US companies that is deemed unfair, you will face retaliation in the form of tariffs and these sorts of things. So the interests of the companies and the government is being put squarely back into the same category, which is really interesting. You see this announcement, which I for some reason got, I think, really underreported. They've appointed the CTOs of Palantir, OpenAI, and Meta as honorary lieutenant colonels in the US Army. Okay, like this to me is fascinating. I don't know why I fell off my chair when I saw that, but nobody else seemed to get reported. But you know, and then even now with the latest deal in regards to chip exports and a lot of the controls that were put there around NVIDIA and AMD and like what they're allowed to sell to China that were deemed sort of like national security assets. Now they're allowed to, but as long as the US government takes a cut. So I think there's this really interesting move. So I think you could debate all day long which one is true, and I'm happy to have that discussion with anyone. But I think the point is that I think in many ways it's often both are true at the same time, and it depends on the context and what people are trying to achieve as to which one feels like the dominant. And that was kind of the punchline of my thesis was I think both are true. Both government and industry play each narrative depending on which one they think is most advantageous to them in a particular negotiating context.
Very interesting answer. Would you say there are some steps that Australia should be taking in preparing for a future that, you know, is questionable by who is taking control of the international rules-based order?
Yes, so I think that we need to be much braver in all of our conversations in Australia right now. I'm often in conversations with leaders in government and industry in like really incredible rooms and conversations, but I do feel there's a hesitancy to really acknowledge some of the fundamental systemic changes that are happening. And even if you're of the view that they are temporary, That's going to take some time to undo, and the current international context that we're operating in is different. And it is interesting, the reluctance to discuss particularly the way that some of these threats would affect a policymaker's confidence to, say, regulate tech in Australia. I think that that's an interesting thing that seems hard for people to discuss. So number one, everybody be more bold about being a bit of real talk, I think is always really valuable, where you feel that you can. I also stranger to doing it anyway. I think there's a few examples that I'm sure people in this room can think of that were not popular with the companies, with the US government. We talk about the media bargaining code, for those that are familiar. The headline being that Australia was the first country to essentially legislate that the big tech platforms needed to have a revenue redistribution model. Basically, they had to pay the media publishers because they were showcasing their content. It was really controversial and was the first time people had done it, and the US government did not like it then. And even last year, we're the first country to ban under 16s from social media. So there's lots of things in the tech policy space generally where Australia seems to be comfortable to go out on a limb and do controversial things. That's not always a good thing, like if it's not done well. So we need to find the right balance between being, what in some of our recent research, and just stop me because otherwise I'll get on a rant. Our most recent report, which we released last week, which is called Tetris for Australia's Future, Aligning Our National AI Priorities. We're talking about, what does Australia do, particularly on AI in this context? How do we balance all these different things that we're speaking about today? We're making the analogy of it's a game of Tetris. These things can all fit together, but you actually have to think about that bigger picture. And one of the blocks that we are talking about is regulatory courage. So actually, I think goes to your point about like what should Australia do in this context? It has to find a way to work with international partners to still take the action that it needs to, whilst allowing enough innovation to thrive.
Thanks, Zoe. In your answer, it comes across that Australia is a bit wary, and I think Dr. Alex, during her presentation this morning, talked about Australia being one of the most concerned countries about AI adoption. So how do you think we can build that institutional trust for AI adoption and kind of push towards it, while also kind of being mindful of the impacts that it can have?
That's a great question, and I've no doubt that I'm glad that it's already come up. Trust is an interesting one because I think obviously it's something that we want to have in our institutions generally. We want people to be able to have it in technology so that we can have adoption in all the right ways. But I also think that, and I'm sort of borrowing from a colleague of mine, Lizzie O'Shea, who's the chair of Digital Rights Watch, because she's put this really beautifully. But I think it's a really good point, which is that Australia is very skeptical. Australians are very skeptical about AI, and I think it sounds like you've already heard about that today. The recent study that I always think is interesting: 36% of Australians say that they're willing to trust AI. That may have been what was quoted earlier. We're lowest of 47 countries. It's kind of fascinating, given that we otherwise have a bit of a track record for being early adopters on a lot of other technology. Think about payments technology and things like that. We do, as a country, adopt quite quickly, but on this one, we're quite skeptical. Lizzie's point, which I think is right, is let's not turn that totally into a weakness. Actually, when we talk about AI literacy, a lot of that is critical use of AI. So it's about understanding, you talk about in the context of misinformation, understanding how to use these tools well so it actually advances you, as opposed to, I receive work from some people and I'm like, oh, you used AI. That can be good or it can be bad depending on how you do it. So I think discerning use of AI is actually really powerful. And so how do we turn the fact that Australians have this sort of starting point of skepticism into an asset? How do we turn that into a good thing? So yes, we need to build confidence, but we don't necessarily want to remove that criticality, because that ability to discern how and when to use it, how to tell when it's been used, is actually possibly going to be really helpful for us. So I think it's a little bit of both.
Yeah, no, I think, it's striking the balance, and I think Australia has one part of it, of the equation going.
We definitely need to build the trust. I'm not trying to say that we don't, just to be really clear, but I think that we don't want to stamp out that questioning.
Thank you. So AI innovation is obviously occurring at a rapid rate globally. So obviously, we heard from the previous panel, but also during Alex's presentation, there are benefits to it, obviously economic benefits, healthcare benefits, all of that does come with it, but also the benefits are not equally distributed. And particularly when we talk about climate change, how our counterparts in Asia are affected with AI, the ethical concerns about AI is, they get far more negative impacts. A lot more families will have to move due to this compared to Australia. So how do you think Australia can be more mindful of the negative impacts of AI when we're looking to collaborate with our Asian counterparts? And also, how do you balance it with equity to ensure inclusive digital growth?
Good question. So I'll bring it back just to the framework of this report that we launched last week, because I think it's a helpful kind of think tool, which is this. So we've put forward this idea that there's 6 national AI priorities: productivity, people and planet, this is always a good test, trusted information in institutions, regulatory courage, national capability, and global governance. And I'm pretty sure, I did a lot of listening to a lot of different groups, and I'm pretty sure that most topics that you'll hear talked about in AI will kind of fall into one of those 6. And I guess the reason I say that first is I think sometimes we, me included, think the good parts of AI and the bad parts, and we think like productivity and growth, and the bad parts is like harms and risks to social. Sometimes it's a bit reductive. I think the reality is that the risk and reward are high on all of those 6 things. So you can get, if you're talking about economic benefit, yes, it might be there, but as we were hearing from the previous panel, but what about how is the disruption in workforce managed? Actually there's going to be some periods of displacement, and if that's not managed well, then you could argue that there's a negative, economic impact on some people, right? So I think firstly it's challenging this idea of it's like productivity good and social harm bad. It's split across all 6. And then it's actually saying, so the answer to your question, I think, is what we're calling for, is saying Australia can't keep having these conversations in silos, because all of these 6 things are not just possible wins and losses of themselves, but they actually are deeply interconnected. Like what we do in one will inherently affect another. And I think often what I'm seeing is that these conversations are happening in deep silos, like lots of expertise, really impressive people coming up with solutions that make sense in that context. But there's not a lot happening that brings all of those conversations together. And so how do we do that? Well, we think that we need a ministerial AI task force. So at the top, at the highest level of government, that there is that conversation where people are forced to do the hard work, which is actually bashing those 6 things together and say, actually, what are we trying to achieve? What trade-offs are we willing to take? Where does this one reinforce another? Or where is it a trade-off? And we actually have to, somebody has to make the hard call of saying, we're going to put this as slightly more important than that at a national level. It's a really difficult thing to do, but I think that is actually what needs to be done. And if you have that ministerial leadership, then that can flow into what we think needs to be a national AI strategy, which will just help all of those things flow through. In terms of your point about international equity on these things, I think that's super fascinating. Some of the research that I do is around AI compute and its global distribution, both from me, I look at it mostly from like a tech and geopolitics perspective. If you're interested in compute sovereignty, I've written a paper on that, but I think your point was more about the kind of social environmental costs of that digital infrastructure, which is incredibly land and energy resource intensive, absolutely. And what's interesting is it's maybe not just the environmental impacts that some of that can have, but even for a country like Australia, that politics of, well, do we want to be a regional compute hub? Is that what we're aiming for? Or are we going to be are we concerned about the energy and environmental policies for ourselves in that? Like, I think these questions are it's a fascinating time to be having this conversation, because they are live questions right now that the government is grappling with in these very weeks. And they need to they basically have to do that trade-off that I was mentioning before. So I think watch this space. There's a lot of thinking going on those things. It's a hard balance to strike.
Yeah, I'd be interested to hear, like, what does Asia see Australia in terms of digital growth? Do they see Australia as a key partner? Do they see Australia as a key supporter, or is Australia falling behind and kind of out of touch with its Asian counterparts?
I would have to ask them that one. I'm happy for anybody in the room who feels they want to speak to a particular country's perspective on Australia. I certainly wouldn't dare to do that. But I guess my observation would be Australia has an interesting role to play in the Indo-Pacific, and I'm not going to go on about this because I have no doubt that other people have articulated this well earlier today already. But I think the kind of one foot in the Five Eyes, but also being, like in the region and having important diplomatic, trusted broker diplomatic kind of reputation positions Australia really in a really interesting way. Being a multicultural society positions us also to have potentially similar, an interesting place to train models that are maybe more representative of our region than other places in the world. So there's some things we can think about there. But I think that particularly in the work that we've recently done, so we published an article in Australian Foreign Affairs, which is talking about, the world order has changed, AI transformation and Trump are colliding, what does Australia do? We think that there's a really big, important role that Australia can play in actually leading a bit of a global coalition of governments that want to retain some of this sort of, like tech policy independence of different countries, and like how do you navigate that in a scenario where the US is throwing its weight around and using its companies so explicitly. So I think that I will leave the how Australia is perceived by other countries to other. For me, there's a role for us to play, which is a bit of a regional broker, and we have quite an interesting track record of tech diplomacy multilateral wins. Australia has been involved in agreeing a lot of cyber norm agreements, and we sort of brokered the agreement that international humanitarian law applies in cyberspace. There's a long track record of trust for Australia here, and I think that we should really use it.
Great, thank you. Just going to wrap up with my final question. So throughout the day, we've heard a lot about bringing the human element into AI strategy and AI policies. It's not about the old Dr. Alex's words again. It's not about bringing AI to Asia. It's about bringing AI for Asia. How we can bring technology not just for the profits or benefits of economic benefits, but talking about how does it benefit humans and what it can do for humans. What are some 3 actions would you say that leaders across the world can take and should be taking to ensure that the emerging technologies are contributing to public good rather than just efficiency and profits?
Great question, and I will try and be brief because I can see I'm keeping you, I'm standing between you and lunch. I actually would add a third trade-off there, because you're saying public good, productivity, and profit. But I actually think a lot of this conversation around AI development is really focused on geopolitical competition. Like, I think so much of when we're talking about it, it's absolute frontier, it's US and China, that's where a lot of the conversation is. But to your point, it's a very different conversation about talking about applicable models that can actually be used to actually have immediate practical benefit in a lot of different societies. And those require they need to operate on less compute, less energy because of the places they're going to operate. So I actually think it's partly shifting the emphasis away from that, we need to have that frontier conversation, that's not going to go away, but how can we really rebalance towards things that will be applicable in countries that aren't trying to have all of the most cutting edge compute and need it to be more nimble. And to what are the practical things that I think we should all think about when we're thinking about these issues. A driving philosophy for us when we at TIPD, at Tech Policy Design Institute, is this idea that technology isn't inventing itself. People are doing that, making decisions. And so I think in everything that we do, whichever sector that you work in, is just really keeping that front of mind. There's an agency that we all have to be shaping this, and whether that's in product development, this idea that if you're building models, you're deciding some of these things up front. But also the second thing, which is linked to the first, is also being realistic, though. The people are making those decisions about what they design and things within an incentive structure. So if you work in policy and you work in government, be realistic that if you do or don't set those incentives, people will make those choices. So be thoughtful about there is a role for sensible, well-designed regulation in this if we want to shape technology to be designed in the way that we want the future we want to see. And the last one, I think, kind of has come up through our whole conversation, which is just collaboration. Think in all times, think about who is in the room, who's not in the room, both in terms of representation, but also, and that applies on diversity, but also like genuinely stakeholder groups, expertise. Like, do you have a technical person in the room, but do you have a lawyer in the room? Do you have someone who has actually built these models before? Do you have, you know, like, I think this problem and opportunity literally applies to everybody, and I think that often I find the rooms that we're in are quite siloed, as I said before. So I think, yeah, just every opportunity you can to mix the group a bit more, I think will always lead to better outcomes, and it's nice to see that we have such a mixed group here today as well.
Thanks, Zoe. Some great takeaways from that conversation. I think, yeah, it is interesting to see how geopolitics actually influences our AI adoption, and how we, Australia can balance both social impact as well as technological advancement in this space. Thank you so much for your insights. I'm going to hand over back to Marnie.
Thank you.